Okay, so this week we're going to continue on looking at the Middle Kingdom, and we'll look at the last half of the Middle Kingdom. And just so you get your time frame placed, so you've got the Old Kingdom, and then the first intermediate period, and then you've got the Middle Kingdom. And I've left out the BC here, but it should be BC. So it goes down to about 1650 BC. When you look at the government of the Middle Kingdom, it's fairly similar to what we looked at in terms of the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. So they are replicating what they learned from the Old Kingdom. And we've talked about this just a little bit when we were looking at the Old Kingdom. You have all of these temples. Remember, this is where the agriculture is grown to support everything. The temples were largely tax exempt, so they weren't paying taxes. Now, this becomes a bit of a problem later because as pharaohs come and go, they create more and more temples, and then you get more and more tax exemptions, so you get less income coming in. This is some of the first time that we see forced labor. We talked about the fact that during the Old Kingdom there weren't slaves, especially building pyramids, but this becomes more and more popular during the Middle Kingdom, and a lot of it is coming from all this expansion that Egypt is doing during this period, and they're capturing both men and women. Now, the government starts to change a little too. So as the government, or as the state, really I should say, gets bigger and bigger, they need to control a bit more. So they form something called a State Department. Now, if you think about state departments in the modern period, like our State Department, that deals with foreign governments. And so the formation of a State Department should tell you a little bit about what's happening in terms of connections with other governments outside of Egypt. And I'll show you a slide in just a bit about how far they're going. And then you also see a separate office just to take care of the palace. And you see more and more posts being created. So what this is essentially telling us is that there's agriculture out there to support a much larger government. And of course, that all pertains directly to sustainability. Now, a few things we talked about that I want you to remember. They're doing irrigation projects in the Fayum. Remember, that's the lake that's off to the side. And it's possible that with all the high floods taking place during the Middle Kingdom, that this is a place where a lot of the water was sort of funneled off and stored. And I also talked a little bit about last time about trade with the Near East. Now, I just talked a bit about forming a State Department. Now, this isn't quite applicable, but you see this big push happening in the to the south, into Nubia. And we talked a little bit about this. This started with Mentuhotep II, and remember he was the first pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom. We see this in Amenemhat I, where we've got graffiti into lower Nubia. And we also see this massive building project for fortresses. And this is just one of them. And I'll have another lecture just on these fortresses. But if you look at the scale down at the bottom, this line is 100 meters or 300 feet. So you can see how large these fortresses are. And I just mentioned there's a big push to go outside of Egypt as well. And so you see these walls being built called the walls of the ruler. You see these pushes into the Middle East. And of course, you also see, which we just talked about, pushing into Nubia and taking more and more. And we haven't talked too much about Nubia, but that is where they're getting a lot of their gold from, precious jewels, and so on. Now, during the 12th dynasty, which was in the Middle Kingdom, you've got Amenemhat II. And remember, their names go Amenemhat I, then Senusret, then Amenemhat II, then Senusret II, so on. This is really a cultural peak during the Middle Kingdom where they have really good agriculture supporting all of this. One really interesting thing that comes out of the Middle Kingdom is something called the Semna Dispatches. And these are letters written from these fortresses back and forth to the Egyptian government. And it can tell us quite a bit about what's going on in Nubia and how the fortresses are set up and so on. I just mentioned this cultural peak. You get lots of building projects, not necessarily pyramids, although you do see some of those, but lots of mining activity. I say peaceful here, but just be aware that Egypt is pushing up into the north and pushing south, so it's certainly not peaceful for those people. You've got lots of literature, writing happening during this period. And I do want to mention that one problem that will come up that will cause the Middle Kingdom to fall is that you've got many people coming from the north moving into northern Egypt that aren't Egyptians. And sometimes these are referred to as Asiatic people. They're coming into northern Egypt as workers, and then what's going to happen is that their population gets large enough that they'll be able to take over, and that causes a disruption of the Middle Kingdom. Now, right after the Middle Kingdom is the second intermediate period. And if you remember, the first intermediate period was really caused by weather issues. The second intermediate period is really caused by these people coming in from the north. They're called the Hyksos, and they took over. So they took over northern Egypt. You do find that, if you remember last week, we talked about how the government moved to a town or a city called Ichtitawe, which we don't know exactly where it is, but it was further south. And that might have lessened the power of the pharaoh in the north, which of course helped when the Hyksos ended up taking over. There's also some indications that there was an epidemic in 13th dynasty, and that caused some problems. So of course that's definitely related to sustainability. But next week we will talk about the second intermediate period.